This is Wicked Problems. I'm Richard Delavan.
Scientists don't start businesses. It's amazing how often they think they know what's going to be a great business, and then their results just don't stack up. So what was the inspiration? I think the inspiration was being around the best minds.
It made sense, but it had never been really proposed before. When it comes to seeing new ideas from scratch, I've seen how hard that is. I was sold on the concept, but I was on the lookout for some deal breaker, like some wall that we wouldn't be able to pass.
Quite a few days here in the UK, with an election result that was both shocking and yet not surprising. The details will matter, they just keep on coming. Patrick Vallance going from figuring out how to accelerate a COVID vaccine to now figuring out how to accelerate the energy transition as a minister. And as we're recording, Chris Stark, who until this morning was the CEO of the Carbon Trust and previously the boss of the Climate Change Committee, will now also enter government as, checks notes, head of mission control from Clean Power by 2030. I thought our business cards were pretty cool here at Wicked Problems. We'll come back to the UK story and smart reactions to the new government and what that might all mean for climate and climate tech. New Prime Minister Keir Starmer has gathered together the most extraordinary collection of climate and energy talent since Ed Miliband dined alone on a bacon sandwich. Today we wanted to step out of the maelstrom of the UK climate politics scene, and in a week when Microsoft trebled down on buying carbon removal credits, this time from Occidental, and Google may follow, given their abandonment of climate neutrality because of a whopping increase in emissions, due to the growth of data centers that are powering AI. Not long after Running Tide became the first big name and carbon removals to the wall, we thought it was important to come back to one of our favorite topics. The co-founders of Tau Carbon out of San Francisco join us. We'll come back to the developing scene here in the UK with folks from media, academia, and politics. We've got episodes lined up on how the exponential growth of solar is triggering a revolution in flexibility in power systems, sustainable travel in time for your holidays, and even the climate tech that dare not speak its name, solar radiation management, aka geoengineering. And you can sign up at wickedproblems.earth to get those episodes straight to your inbox, and if so inclined, help support our work. Now, here's my conversation with Tau Carbon. Well, John and Amber, co-founders of Tau Carbon, thanks for coming on Wicked Problems.
Thanks for having us.
Good to be here.
Awesome. Early-ish for you guys in San Francisco. We're talking to you from a little bit later our time here in the UK, but super excited you could join us. You guys are really one of the, it's not quite the OGs, but like you've been around in the carbon removals space for a bit, and I think our listeners, many of them would have heard of you guys. But maybe just take us a little bit back in terms of, first of all, either John or Amber, if you can jump in and just give us like the 30-second version of what Tau Carbon does, and then I'd like to get back into the origin story about what brought you to this.
Well, Tau Carbon removes CO2 from the atmosphere by taking wood waste, could be any lignocellulosic biomass, and preventing it from decomposing. And we found that keeping the biomass dry is the best way to keep it from decomposing. And obviously, we're going to get into that quite a bit in this conversation, but that is really the top line.
Okay, great. And in terms of how you came to be doing this, I mean, John, you were a lawyer, or still are a lawyer, I suppose, but you got involved in chemical engineering and then coming to climate tech. So maybe before we talk to Amber, we want your journey as well. John, can you give us a little bit of color about what made you decide to take this path?
Well, we're going to cite influences at the end. I'll just spoil that right now and say Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth. We're going back to like 2006 was very influential for me. But 2006 was the year I graduated from law school. And then I took a pretty conventional career path. I worked for a federal judge in the United States. I worked for a law firm in New York City. Got about 3 years into that. And I said, this is not the problem I want to be working on. And I was 30 years old at the time. And I said, I'm young enough to switch, try something different before, life catches up and commitments pile up. So I just walked away from the job. I just walked out at the end of 2010. And I said, I'm going to go back to school. I'm going to study. At the time, I wasn't sure if it was chemistry or chemical engineering. I settled on chemical engineering. And I said, I want to come up with something that helps with climate change, but I need to know something about the science first. So the first step was educating myself. So switched, and I was able to attend the City College of New York in New York City.
Oh, amazing.
I must have done pretty well because I got my bachelor's there, and then went into Stanford University for the PhD program in chemical engineering. And at the time, this was 2015 when I went to Stanford, electrochemical conversion of carbon dioxide, which is a technology a lot of your listeners are probably familiar with. It was very hot. Still is hot to some extent, but at that time I really believed in it. You're going to take all this abundant solar and wind electricity, we're going to run it through electrochemical reactors, we're going to turn CO2 back into fuels. And I worked on that technology at Stanford, but I'd have to say I eventually saw its flaws. I saw its limitations. And I don't want to drone on for too long, but that's kind of what got me to the point where I was looking for a different problem to work on. So how about Amber? Why don't you get your spiel in there?
Sure, because my journey with climate and energy related things also started with an inconvenient truth. I was in early mid-20s or so at the time, kind of finishing up college. I was already committed to being a chemical engineer and a chemist. When I graduated, I actually went to work for Dow. And there were a couple of options there that I could do. And what I ended up going with was working on building insulation materials to reduce the carbon footprint and energy footprint of buildings. They were mostly focused on reducing costs through reducing energy, but I was really drawn to the CO2 footprint part of it. And I started thinking about other things I could do that could kind of make this industry less bad. That's the way I was kind of thinking of things at that time. And so I decided, well, I could study catalysis. So catalysts are, materials that can make chemical processes basically use less energy, run cleaner, and everyone wins. It's cheaper and it's less dirty. But to do that, you need a PhD to get in that part of the company. It's difficult research. So I ended up going back to get a PhD in chemical engineering from Berkeley to study catalysts to make basically actually oil cracking run better. And the longer I was out in the West Coast, I got a lot more exposure to the energy and CO2 problem. And it was also more front and center. This was 2009 when I went back. And by the time I finished my PhD 6 years later, I decided actually to not go back to the oil industry or the chemical industry. So I went down to the South Bay to Stanford to do a postdoc using my skills in catalysis to convert CO2 into fuels and chemistry. So that's actually where I crossed paths with John. We were in the same lab. And the lab was looking mostly at electrochemical methods, but they were also looking at what's called thermal heterogeneous catalysis methods, which is what I was working on. And I did that for a couple of years. And for a number of reasons, the continuing on the research path to be like a staff scientist or like a career researcher wasn't really appealing. I didn't see it making such an impact, especially in this field. CO2 is a hard molecule to convert. And so John reached out to me on my way out, and kind of from there, he told me this idea, and from there we worked on it to different extents. I actually did go back briefly to industry, but I came back full time on a nonprofit we started called Exequest Carbon, and then we went for profit in May, and here we are.
That's interesting. So, maybe just take us back to that conversation, both of you, in terms of making a decision. Yeah, we're gonna have we think we've got an idea about how to do something, and so we're gonna have a go. So maybe just take us in the room for that chat very briefly.
Well, I'll tell you, it kind of started. This is fall 2018, and I don't know if any of your listeners remember the Paradise Fire in California, but it was a dramatic event where I think something like 70 or 100 people were kind of burned alive trying to escape this wildfire. Anyway, it sort of put a spotlight on this forest fire problem in California. And that was dovetailing with a tree mortality problem, which is ongoing. California had been in a drought. Drought is less severe at this point, but still hundreds of millions of trees have died in recent years. And so one of the things you do to mitigate forest fires is to thin the forest and remove excess biomass. And what was becoming clear was that you need to do more of that thinning, but there's no use for the wood. the wood that you're taking out when you do forest thinning is the small trees, small diameter, non-merchantable is the technical term for it. And so I said, I've seen the limitations of my own research, but I was thinking, you got to get to a gigaton scale solution in terms of carbon removal and photosynthesis. People, all of us who work in carbon removal see the potential of photosynthesis, whether you're working on seaweed or biochar or BECCS or whatever. So you see that the plants and trees pick up the CO2 for free and they make wood. And so I was just thinking, like, what's a new way of handling this? What could be something more efficient than BECCS, bioenergy with CCS, biochar, even wood burial. A guy named Ning Zheng had been proposing wood burial for 10 years before that. And it occurred to me that you'd want to do as little as possible. Like, what's the simplest thing you could do with waste wood that would get it into a stable form? And so above ground storage really appealed to me because you can keep it dry. Amber and I are chemical engineers. The chemical engineers specialize in processes where you're managing large amounts of material, you're managing a key property like moisture, and so minimizing energy inputs into it. And so let's just keep it dry, and then worry about engineering the system that will maintain those conditions for hundreds of years. And that's kind of how the conversation went. It was more like, it was the kind of conversation where I said, why not? Why can't we do this? And it did. I mean, obviously, when you have a new idea, you're always a little worried that you're missing something. Is there some drawback to what I'm doing that makes this a bad idea? But Amber and I went through quite an extended period of picking it apart and saying, like, oh, are we taking too much biomass out of ecosystems? Are we hurting soils somehow? Are we using too much land? And one by one, we took care of those issues. So Amber, how about your side of it? How did it sound to you at the beginning?
Yeah, so it made sense, but it had never been, really proposed before. So when it comes to seeing new ideas from scratch, I've seen how hard that is. Something can seem simple, but ends up, it's never as simple as you think. There's always unknown unknowns. And so for a while, I was always, I was sold on the concept, but I was on the lookout for some deal breaker, like some wall that we wouldn't be able to pass. Like, not that I thought it was there, but I wanted to be sure that I had covered everything before I really kind of committed to this, because this idea, like I said, no one was saying we should do this. And so I kept asking, well, why? And I could never come up with a good reason for why. Like professors that we talked to about the idea, one professor said, well, this is too applied, so I wouldn't want to work on this. And then another professor told John something along the lines of, well, how would you make money off of this? And just those were the kinds of pushback that we were getting. And so none of it was technical. But yeah, I realized after a while, when I did come back full time to work on this problem with John, that actually you just kind of have to make it work. If you can't find any problems out there because no one's done it, you have to tackle the problem. You just have to kind of do that. Get out there.
So that's really interesting. Back in 2018, correct me if I'm wrong, because you guys are really more in the milieu, but it feels like to me, in talking to many other people in the space, that in 2018, carbon removals was almost in this like geoengineering bucket, right? Where it was this exotic, like crazy idea, like up there with like putting sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere or cloud whitening or albedo increase in the Arctic or whatever. But it's so gone from that to something that, Microsoft, Stripe, Google, whoever are willing to put money behind because they see potential in it in ways that they're not, so far anyway, putting money behind some of these other things. So what was that like in terms of going for something that was like really at that time, again, from a layperson's perspective, seems like it might have been considered fringe to some or sci-fi to something that now is like, we talk about this actually really quite a lot in mainstream circles.
Well, I think you've put your finger on an important trajectory, which is that if this has gone out of the ivory tower into the real world. And so in 2018, I believe the National Academies of Sciences in the US had come out with a big study on, at that time it was called negative emissions technologies. And so they said, well, these are the 6 that we're going to use, and let's allocate research to support them. But in the real world, you're gonna have to build a business to do this. Like philanthropies and governments may mandate CDR at some point, but the DOE is not going to remove all the CO2 from the atmosphere. And so I think there was just a gap between this ivory tower type thinking and what's going to work in the real world. And maybe it's because I've been a lawyer before. I've seen sort of regulatory issues that businesses face. I saw a lot of issues with DAC. I saw technical issues with direct air capture, even rock weathering, all these things there are plenty of startups doing these things today. But Amber and I took a close look at those technologies, and we said, for one reason or another, none of these others are particularly appealing. Energy consumption, you name it, side effects in the environment. So we said, let's push something that goes a bit against the grain. And if it goes against the ivory tower grain, we'll live with that for a while, because scientists don't start businesses. Like, scientists are not businessmen. It's amazing how often they think they know what's going to be a great business, and then how their results just don't stack up. So, go back to what was the inspiration? I think the inspiration was being around the best minds. Like, Amber and I were at Stanford and Berkeley. I was working with people from Caltech as part of my research. We were in the middle of the best thinking on this subject that was out there. And not to say that I respected the science that was being done, but as far as how that was going to translate into solutions in the real world, I didn't think these people had it figured out. And I certainly didn't think the options on the table were sufficient or optimal. So I said, I know as much as you guys, basically. I don't have 20 years of experience as a professor, but I am able to, sit in the same seminar room with you and have an intelligent conversation about this. And I was not that impressed with the solutions on the table. So,
yeah, I can add to that. So when it comes to the trajectory going back to 2018, 2019, and actually still to some extent, what I noticed was, and I think this was part of the pushback that we got, was that a lot of the ideas were starting in university labs. And so if you also have those same people, those technical people, deciding on the direction, I think they're going to be biased towards what they're good at technically and scientifically. So say someone's really good at electrochemistry. They're going to say, how can I use electrochemistry to help climate change or to stop climate change, or whatever it is. And I think that what was potentially happening was people weren't zooming out enough to the big picture of how would you actually do this at gigaton scale. And when you zoom out enough, you have to start asking what's really going to perturb the carbon cycle a little, because we have, as humans, majorly perturbed that cycle. And if you zoom out and ask, well, where are the sources and the sinks, and how can we interfere with that, with that? Because you can do that potentially at gigaton scale. And that's kind of where this idea of biomass being stored came out. And like John said before, there were a couple of professors that proposed preserving biomass, like Ning Zhang from Maryland back in 2005-ish, or is when I think he first proposed this. And around the same time or a little earlier, there's the guy named Stuart Strand out of, I think, Florida, who said, why don't we sink biomass? Neither of these people were taken seriously at the time. But I think it's, like I said, mostly because these ideas were coming from engineers, and engineers have very focused skills, and they may not be thinking big picture initially. So,
well, I think I think that's a very interesting evolution in the whole sector, and I think it's an interesting lesson for folks who are, to your point, your terminology, John, in the ivory tower. But in terms of so for an investor, for a non-expert, so can you give us a 30-second version? And I know we're all friends in the carbon removal space. I know we're not competing. Of course, it's all a portfolio approach, and no one's ever going to say anything, blah, blah, blah. But if you're sitting in a private room with someone from Frontier, from JP Morgan or something, and they're like, yeah, but why should I give $500,000 to you as opposed to some other pathway? Or sit down with Kara Maisano from RMI and saying yeah, but here's how the numbers actually stack up from what we're doing and how they differ from having to spend what Climeworks is doing. Again, I know no one wants to talk about this in public, but I think we're getting to the point where people need to understand how to make these distinctions. So give us 30 seconds about why we should pay attention to you, give money to you, as opposed to some other pathway?
It's the business side of it. Ours is going to be a low cost solution. And then also on the business side, it's a solution that can be deployed at scale without all these side effects in terms of energy consumption, pollution of the environment. You know, a lot of side effects can come into play in CDR. It's about convincing people like the folks you mentioned. That process, I think, has actually come quite far. The biomass preservation, whether it's sinking in the ocean or burying, is on the menu today. And so Tau, I think, is just the next step in terms of how do you preserve biomass. So that's how I would present it.
I guess I would similarly present it. I would emphasize, especially to the investor crowd, cost. So we have been treated like we're going to be high cost. And I think that just comes from it being a new process or seemingly new. But it's actually a low cost process because we are not injecting things underground. We're storing things above the ground where space is essentially free to go up. So if we were injecting something underground or burying something underground, you have to dig out every cubic yard that you need. And so your costs are not going to go down as you go deeper in the ground. Our costs go down as the containers get bigger and taller because of surface area going down. So relative to volume. So it's, I would emphasize cost. We don't have to worry about landfill permitting also. So there's convenience. The technology is simple, but complex enough that we have IP moats. I know that's important to investors too. So those are the things that I would emphasize.
Got it. That makes sense. The other people that are kind of in your space, and again, forgive me for my ignorance, but I just want to make sure I'm situating you guys in the right box. No one likes being in a box. I understand that, but like Vaulted Deep, Graphite, other companies that are doing this kind of direct biomass storage with different methodologies. I just want to make sure I'm in the same universe that you guys are playing in. Is that right?
Roughly, yes. Although, if we want to get into those companies, we certainly can.
Sure. I mean, and again, I would rather actually get into another company, if you don't mind, which is that, again, so we're at this interesting moment. So Bloomberg today, Alistair Marsh, again, we didn't prep for this. So we haven't talked about this news piece that ran earlier. But Alistair Marsh and Bloomberg had a very interesting piece about the carbon removals market and how we might be approaching this tipping point where there are just, and I've heard this from many founders in the space already, so it wasn't a surprise to me and probably won't be a surprise to you, but there are so many startups and so few buyers that, we have this mismatch, right? And so we are entering this moment where, we are seeing different companies looking at different methodologies. And I guess the question is going to become increasingly under scrutiny about like, how do you respond to those market challenges, right? So, and we obviously recently had Running Tide, for very unfortunately for them and the people who worked with them, have a series of pivots in what they were attempting to do with sinking biomass, initially with somehow involving kelp and algae around a thing, and then they kind of pivoted and then was out to sea past Iceland. And so there are a number of questions. They raised by 53 million, I believe, from Lower Carbon and a few other VCs, which and had 100 employees at one point between Maine and Iceland. And like a couple of weeks, Friday before last, they basically put up the white flag and said, "Yeah, we're done. We're going to cease trading essentially." But I guess the question, I know Robert Hoogland and some other observers of the space have actually really called on these guys to say, like, publish your data. Please tell us what went right, what went wrong. But that feels like the first big name that people might have heard of that kind of went to the wall in your space. So as a, kind of prominent member of the community in carbon removals, what was your reaction to that news? And like, what do you think, we should make of it going forward?
Well, it was certainly a big moment because the investors behind Running Tide are the biggest names in the space. And to see them wave the white flag, as you put it, and give up was something I wasn't expecting, to be honest. They had purchases. They had no trouble selling credits. It's a little unclear to me then if you could sell credits, which many companies have trouble getting those first sales, what then was the obstacle? And that I think that will come out in time. Now, there are a lot of people who were involved who know the inside story. I certainly don't know anything about the inside story.
And sorry, I'm not pretending you do.
But to go back to the first point you were making about this critical moment in the space, you are right that there are more suppliers than there are buyers. But that is coexisting with an attempt by the buyers, I'm going to use a controversial phrase here, to sort of pick the winners. A company like Volta Deep got a $50 million offtake from Frontier. Do they need $50 million in offtake to scale up? I'm not sure. Maybe 10 million would have been sufficient. And you could have spread the remaining 40 million offtake among 4 other candidate technologies. So why does Charm need another 50 or $60 million offtake? Whereas other companies would give anything to sell 1,000 or 10,000 credits. So that's a very interesting discussion to have. I'm not the person to answer that question. We personally, Tau Carbon, we're out there selling credits, or at least doing our best to try to sell credits. And there are other people besides Frontier and Microsoft and those folks who buy credits. So, but I would say, speaking generally for the whole space, yes, more companies would get to those next milestones in terms of funding and scale up if there were, I think, a more equal distribution, maybe more of a like bet placing approach to your credit purchases. Like, let's buy from 20 different companies instead of 2, and then see how those 20 perform with the funds that come in.
One of the reasons that we wanted to have this conversation is because it feels like to me, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, but like the pathway that you guys are on, one of the challenges for running Tide, in addition to their pivots about the methodology, is measurability, right? If you're using an ocean methodology, like it's really, really hard to extrapolate out and come up with like, okay, what are you actually removing? And therefore, how can you price that? Whereas you can kind of see everything you guys are doing the whole way through the value chain. And I wanted to explore that a little bit because I wanted to see, what you guys had to say about the MRV aspects of the pathway that you guys are on.
That's Amber's specialty.
So there's, like you said, it's easy to trace everything because we are basically more of what we're starting to call a closed system approach versus something that's open. How do you quantify that? How do you price it? And then how do you monitor it too? It's really goes beyond pricing. How do you know you did anything? So from a technical standpoint, I mean, you can trace everything. You can see it all. It's literally above ground, and it's straightforward to do the standard type of instrumentation that you do, like monitoring for gases, conditions such as humidity and temperature that would influence whether decomposition can occur, and then in the event that there was something that went wrong, like if some water got in or something like that, you can intervene quite easily. And I'll add to that more technical things, which is we're also storing in an aerobic atmosphere because we're above ground. So if decomposition does happen, you can't actually get methane. We've done this experiment. You get a little CO2 if you put water in, and that's it. So, and it's also easy to price us because we know where all our materials are coming from. We can do a very detailed TEA. We're actually piecing together really a lot of off-the-shelf mature technology, like the wood densification technology that we're using, and the graphite is using. It's mature technology. It's wood briquetting. It's done all over the world. There are numerous TEAs done on it, and the container material that we're using is the same situation. We're redesigning the container, but it's similar enough, and we know exactly where the materials are coming from, what the carbon footprint of those materials are, that it's very easy to figure out what our net removal is. And net removal is really how you price the carbon as well. Right. So there's a lot more certainty in both the MRV and the how to price us.
I mean, look, I guess that for me, again, as somebody who's relatively new to really observing this space in quite the granular detail that you guys have been in for really quite a much longer time, I suppose that there is a kind of a learning curve, right, for the casual or layperson observing, where they look at DAC and they go like, sexy, awesome, cool, love it, let's see that, and they're like initially starting out with like wood. Don't love it, but like. In terms of when you say it's low cost, right? Like graphite obviously had some backing, I think, from Breakthrough in terms of, like getting it's a lovely press release that they put out, making a hugely important claim about how low they could get the cost. If you're, like able to say like where you guys are or where you might end up, I suppose, are you comparable to what graphite is claiming in terms of that? Or like what looks, because again, like the scale piece, to your point, John, the vegetation management aspects of like where you get this waste wood in order to be able to have a feedstock to be able to do this stuff. Like I buy the whole case, right? Like multiple co-benefits to what you're talking about. But ultimately someone at the end of the day is going to look at the ledger and go like, okay, what is it? Are you over the under Granholm's $100 a ton, basically?
Sure. And we are under $100 per ton. Amber, it's $50 per ton at one of our full-size sites. But you mentioned graphite and breakthrough energy, and I just have to tell this side of the story, which is when we conceived the idea at Stanford, late 2018, the first quarter of 2019, there was a class taught at Stanford called Stanford Energy Ventures at the time. And who was running the class? It was two principals, investors from Breakthrough Energy Ventures. And so we took the class. Amber and I led a team of Stanford students, and we developed the idea. At the time, it was just dry wood chip storage. We weren't compressing the chips. Those guys listened to everything we ever came up with, all the ideas, all the pitches. We presented to a panel that was convened by them, investors at the end of the quarter. And they laughed us out of the room. They had no time for us, no interest. But then we went and started our nonprofit. At the end of, through 2019, we applied to Activate, Cyclotron Road, all these standard opportunities for developing a company, and rejected. So we said, we're just going to develop this on our own through a nonprofit. You can have a research nonprofit. We did that with ExaQuest Carbon. We competed in the X Prize. And then our backers for the X Prize said, you should start a company. And when that happened, we sort of reappeared on Breakthrough Energy's radar. And people from Breakthrough Energy reached out to us in mid-2022, not the people who founded graphite, but within like 1 degree of separation. And they were grilling us about, how are you going to do this? How's it going to work? And when we founded Tau, or when we closed the pre-seed round in early 2023, the same month that we told them the first checks had come in, that's when graphite was founded, February 2023. So we are like separated at birth, graphite and Tau. It's a really interesting story. They've sworn to us that they did not take any of our ideas, but they are doing the exact same thing we're doing, which is taking dried wood, compressing it into briquettes for the exact same reason we do, which is a space efficiency. They just want to dig a hole and put it underground. We insist that you should do it above ground. So the best thing that ever happened to Tau was the founding of graphite, because they are out there banging the drum for why this is a great solution. And I agree with everything they say about scalability and verifiability. We just happen to believe we have a better mousetrap for how you preserve the wood over the long term. But that's a juicy little tidbit for your listeners.
I've heard a version of that story before, so that is interesting. And I suppose, like, I get in your favor, pioneers get shot, right? So I suppose you have an opportunity to be able to learn from perhaps other things that I'm looking at right now. I'm looking at CDR.FYI and looking at where graphite is, and like, compared to Volta Deep in terms of tons sold. It's still early stage for them, so we'll see how that goes. But interesting. And I suppose, we at an earlier episode, again, I'm not suggesting that you're saying that any skullduggery happened here at all, but
I think it was inspiration, not skullduggery. We actually inspired them. They saw us go out and do this.
Which is, again, and so, I'm not, like I said, I'm not saying you're putting words in your mouth. I'm not saying you're accusing anybody, but it is interesting and sometimes fraught to figure out, like, success has many fathers, as they say. So the idea that, the one idea could be floating around and people could have modified and improved on it, and then and then slept on it and like, oh, this is totally my idea. And like, no malign intent, but basically like, yeah, I don't know where I came up with that. That's amazing.
Well, the truth is, somebody should do it the Tau way, above ground storage, because we believe in that. And somebody should do it the graphite way. And the graphite is doing their thing, and more power to them. I'm very happy to see them pursuing this and giving it the visibility that helps all of us. So, we've believed in that more generally about biomass preservation. So when the first biomass sinking startups appeared, so Carboniferous and Rewind, I mean, that was great news because again, it's going back to the original thinking, which was, yes, biomass is a very efficient form of captured carbon. Plants and trees do it for free. That now the question is, what do you do with this material? And there are many, many options. So I'm very glad to see the space growing. But Amber and I firmly believe that you should do it in the way that's the lowest cost and is going to avoid methane emissions. And that's where I think Tao has the advantage. So.
No, and again, I think that is a very compelling story, which I'm sure our listeners will be very interested to hear more about. So we'll put some stuff in the show notes where they can find out more. But look, we kept you for more than half an hour at this point, and I think there are a couple things that we wanted to get into before we let you go. One of which was just in terms of, we referenced it earlier, and I'm not even going to talk about the election because it makes me too sad. But it does seem, I'll just make as a passing observation, that if any subsector within climate tech is probably going to actually benefit from any potential political change that might happen in the United States this year, it feels like you guys, your subsector is probably going to be okay because there's so many people who need you guys to succeed in some way. I'm not going to ask you to comment on that because I appreciate that's pretty fraught, but I just making a passing observation. So I just wanted to move from that to then talking about the prospects for really the overall market. So we've talked about this a little bit, right? So I'll both ask Amber and John. We have this issue, right? We have a potentially now an oversupply of sellers and an undersupply of buyers. If you had the ear of the next president of the United States, or the next Speaker of the House, or the next head of Secretary of Energy, what would be your advice to them about what they need to do to prime the pump to make this a market that actually can work to grow businesses like yours?
I have something I want to say, but Amber, you should go first.
I guess I would say at the right price, you can sell anything, right? And so what's out there right now is really expensive. And you've got all these big corporates that want to go net zero. And there's a small supply of relatively expensive solutions out there, expensive per ton. So I think that if we can make it easier for the less expensive solutions like ours to scale, then the market could really take off. Now, I think the reason it hasn't is that before there was this idea that you need 10,000 year permanence and things like that. But that's actually not the case. You just have to remove the carbon from the air from a fast cycle and put it into a slow cycle, keep it stored. And that's really all you have to do. You don't have to store it for 10,000 years. So I guess I would just, say focus on helping the solutions that are already cheap, and that will get the price down. Demand will go up, and I think the market will start to develop more because you'll have more transactions. And then, John, you had something?
Yeah, I would say there's more than one CDR technology out there, because if you look at federal policy these days, you'd think that it was only direct air capture. So 45Q, which is this tax credit, it's $180 per ton for CO2 removed, only applies to direct air capture with underground injection of CO2. Happens to be something the oil industry is well positioned to do, but make it tech neutral. Any CDR that meets a certain durability threshold gets 45Q or something equivalent to it. Same thing with the research hubs. They threw $1 billion at direct air capture hubs, which is fine for direct air capture, but there was nothing comparable in terms of research funding for the other CDR technologies. And it's not just biomass based, it's the rock weathering, the ocean alkalinity methods, not getting anywhere near the level of support that direct air capture is getting. And I think that's changing. The CDR purchase program the DOE is running is more tech neutral.
I was going to ask about that.
But the research funding and pilot funding is not, and the tax credit and policy support has been completely slanted towards DAC. And that is, well, it's a scandal, honestly. It really should change.
Well, I guess like if you were a betting person and you were looking forward 10, 15 years, I mean, folks have put forward on the basis of like the polluter pays principle, the idea that someday there'll be a carbon take back obligation, right? So if you're Oxy, who's obviously been an innovator in the space, or if you're some of the other carbon majors, oil majors, however you want to call them these days, that having a low cost solution as opposed to the stuff that just happens to suit their tech stack at the moment, it feels like that'd be an interesting argument to put in the back pocket of some people who might be helping make policy over the next couple of years, depending on no matter what stripe, what jersey they're going to wear. So, I mean, I suppose a bit tricky, but I mean, do you think something like a carbon take back obligation is really going to be the thing that is necessary to make this work?
Yes, that's something I hear a lot about the market, is that there's no obligation to buy CDR. There are many different ways to create that obligation. I guess I would look towards the renewable energy space. Whatever cap and trade seemed to be fairly effective there. And then once cap and trade had its own momentum, the market took it from there. Solutions were low cost enough to survive without that support. Yeah. But Amber, your thoughts?
Oh. Amber, you're on mute. Sorry
about that. I mean, I still think it's a matter of just like getting the price low enough. I think that if your costs are low enough, I don't think you're going to need all these incentives. I mean, CO2 removal, I think there's demand is kind of like intrinsic demand, I think is really kind of going up. I think there's going to be more consumer awareness, and if it's cost effective, I think consumers will be, cool with that, and anyone who buys it, really. So yeah, I think it's really about getting low cost solutions out there that will scale.
Right. Well, look, I mean, we could go on for really quite a long time. I've really enjoyed this conversation. John and Amber, thank you so much for taking the time. So 2 quick things before I let you go. One, what's next for you guys? What's a milestone that our listeners should be looking out for in order to be able to anticipate what the next move is for Tau?
Well, the big thing we're working on right now is a pilot in South Dakota. So a lot of our competing biomass solutions need permits to do what they're doing in the ocean or for landfills. Tau was able to find a place in western South Dakota where there is no above ground zoning. And so we purchased a site, and we will be able to proceed immediately to build our above ground wood storage. And we're hoping to do 10,000 tons in the next 12 months. So am I missing something, Amber?
Nope, that's it.
So as Texas became for wind and solar to some extent, South Dakota, Governor Neom could be actually your home for carbon removals in a way that just make it happen, guys. I love it.
Possibly, but I don't think that was our intention. It's just a low regulation state.
I'm not sure it was for Governor Bush either when he was governor. Right. So, but I think the main thing is that the regulatory environment is the regulatory environment. So we're doing an episode coming up, just to trail that, with actually companies who've come from this part of the world to set up in Austin because of those issues, generally in the energy space and the electricity space. So look out for that. But before I let you go, again, super happy you guys could join us. So excited to make the connection. Hope you'll come back soon. But we ask founders who come on the show, and you've given us one hint already in terms of Al Gore. But if you had each 1 or 2 things that we call catalysts, influences that you've read or watched or listened to, or experiences, we've had all sorts of things that made you decide, like, this is what I want to do, and then maybe changed your point of view about really to focus on why you're doing it the way you're doing it. So if you had a couple things to share with the audience, what would they be?
Amber, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I guess one thing I would add that influenced me is, it's not actually really climate related, but kind of relating to what do you do with technology? It's I don't know if you've ever seen it, but there's the movie Good Night and Good Luck about Edward Murrow. So it's like one of my favorite movies. And I liked how at the end he talked about the television, what it can be used for. What is it, just to distract us, and entertain us, which of course that's great too, but it can be used, to educate. And if you're not using it in with the bigger picture of society in mind. It's just, I think what he said, lights and wires in a box. And that really influenced my thinking. I went to school for chemistry, chemical engineering, and that in the early to mid 2000s, that was a pretty powerful skill set to have. That actually was the highest compensated major at the time for graduating students. So then what can you do? What do you do with that? Do you go work for Exxon and make a killing right out of undergrad? Or, do you use those skills for something like this? So that's a movie I've watched a few times over the years that has influenced my thinking.
Amazing. I look forward to go back and watching it again. I think it's probably David Strathairn's best performance of his career. So yeah, I love that film. Lovely. Thank you for sharing that.
And mine is sort of at the other end of the spectrum. It's not related to technology, but when the idea occurred to me in 2018 to really pursue, wood preservation for CDR, I was really inspired by Greta Thunberg. I think that's how you say her name, but Thunberg. Thunberg. Okay, we never get it right, but she just was inspirational in the sense that she galvanized people and got them, made them realize how powerful they could be acting together, and that was kind of the inspiration behind our nonprofit to research wood preservation. Was I've always been convinced that it's a competent technical solution, but I also think it's the most accessible, and it's the least, it's sort of, biomass is everywhere, all over the world, and anybody could preserve it and do CDR. And I think it's the kind of solution that has the potential to really be a workforce driver, an industry of the future, or something that mobilizes the masses, as opposed to single isolated, very high-tech stainless steel DAC facilities, which are owned all by Bill Gates and a few other billionaires. There's something more democratic, I think, and more mainstream or mass movement about biomass storage that has always appealed to me. And I'm looking forward to seeing that play out in the future.
Well, I think, John, you've certainly made me think about it more and have another look. And thank you both, you and John and Amber, for coming on to the show. We're super excited you come on to Wicked Problems, and we wish you the best. We hope you'll keep in touch and come back soon to tell us, and update us on your progress.
We certainly will. We're looking forward to it. Thank you for having us.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It helps others find the show. For an ad-free experience, consider becoming a paid subscriber at wickedproblems.earth. You'll get our newsletter, show notes, and exclusive content. Wicked Problems explores the intersection of people, politics, technology, and capital, and whether it creates a future you'd want to live in. Wicked Problems is written and edited by Richard Delavan, with production assistance from me, Theodore Delavan. Special thanks to Sun Charmer for our phenomenal theme music. Thanks for listening.